I'm happy to welcome you to the launch of John Barton's new book of poetry, Lost Family. Hi, my name is Carmine Starnino, and I'm the poetry editor for Vehicle Press. I'm happy to welcome you to the launch of John Barton's new book of poetry, Lost Family, a Memoir. It's a doubly special night because we also have as a guest Fredericton poet Ross Leckey, who, as it happens, was one of the first, if not the first, poets to be published in Signal Editions, the poetry series that I edit. Ross will be interviewing John after his reading, and it's a delight for me that we managed to bring together the newest poet in the series with the earliest. After that discussion, we'll have a question and answer period, and so I encourage you all to pose your questions wherever you may be streaming this, Facebook or YouTube. We will be monitoring those comments, selecting the best questions, and one of those questions will win a free copy of the book. Now, to the matter at hand. If the full story of Canadian poetry ever gets written, John Barton deserves to take up a large chunk of it. John has been active, and at the highest levels, as an editor, critic, and poet for close to 3 decades. His output in these spheres of production has been prodigious in scale, scope, and quality, all of which makes him something of a unique figure in Canadian letters. His critical and creative work often has been central to the national conversation about poetry. John edited 2 of Canada's most prominent literary magazines, Arc and the Malahat Review. Speaking personally, he is the ideal editor, tough but not bloody-minded, incredibly well-informed, generous, and thoughtful. He is as committed to the excellence of the writing of those he is editing as he is to his own work. It's been my privilege to have been taught a great deal by him, not only about my own writing, but about creative writing and Canadian poetry in general. His work as an anthologist, and I'm thinking specifically of Seminal, the anthology of Canada's gay male poets, has shaped the country's sense of the LGBTQ canon, a canon that his own 11 books of poetry belongs to, as well as being themselves examples of some of the most beautiful, profound, and well-crafted verse written in Canada in recent years. Those poems have earned him 3 Archibald Lampman Awards, an Ottawa Book Award, a CBC Literary Award, and a National Magazine Award. Born in Edmonton and raised in Calgary, John now makes his home in Victoria, BC, where he is currently the city's poet laureate. Last year, he published his first book of essays, We Are Not Avatars, and the second section of that book, called Phantom Diary, concerns his coming of age as a gay man in Alberta. The poetry book we are launching tonight, his 12th, is a kind of phantom diary. Lost Family is a book of sonnets that he has shaped into a memoir. It's an extraordinary collection that explores the deaths of his parents and sister, as well as chronicles much of his restless early years through to adulthood. Audience warning, there's a lot of sex in this book. The real star of the show is John's sonneteering. Quietly virtuosic, finely calibrated, his sonnets manage to compress so much information without giving up an inch of their fluency. They are sonnets that often don't sound anything like sonnets. As you hear him read, remember that each of them is a single long sentence threaded through 14 lines. Lost Family is without question his best work, astonishing, consoling, heartbreaking. I'm really pleased to introduce this book to all of you tonight and to welcome John Barton.
Thank you, Carmen, and for a wonderful and humbling introduction. And I'm very honored to be with Signal and with Vehicle, and the book has kind of been a magic process for me. And I'd like to thank everyone attending online. While I can't see you, I know you are there. Thanks for indulging my talking head. If you haven't seen the book, it's gorgeous, absolutely beautiful. But to prevent the noise of flipping pages and rustling paper, I'm going to read off my iPad. Lost Family, a Memoir, is a compilation of over 100 sonnets. There are many forces that spurred me to write these poems, which are a subset of over 375 sonnets I have written since March of 2016. What motivated me to begin was the desire to remember my father, my mother, and my sister Pam, each of whom died between 2005 and 2015, and my mother and sister 7 months apart. These poems shed light on the life for good and bad that we shared. As Carmen mentioned, I grew up in Calgary in the 1960s and 70s. Many of the poems are set in what I think of as a lost Alberta. From there, they radiate outwards. So I'm going to begin with the opening poem in the book, which is about my origins. A Google Maps view of the house where I grew up. Why must I see it from above? The time lapse trapped in some undated spring I can't account for. The crab apples flaunting flesh-toned blossoms in the backyard, climbing branch after retouched branch above unmown grass past the roof. Ambition noted. Beds impatient, with daffodils dug up and spread, with added leaves below windows, if blown up larger, might appear undraped. Emptied kitchen cupboards airless, footfalls scoring speckled tiles long stripped away. No present left to loiter through. Petals shed, brainstem extant in unturned soil. The locked front door yellow still. Impulse to knock, hesitant. After I finished the poem, I actually realized I was conflating two houses. My mother moved out of the house where I grew up into the house next door. And they had almost exactly the same floor plan. It was eerie. I grew up, as I said, in Calgary, and during a period of tremendous growth, both in sprawl and in height. I've had a fascination with tall buildings ever since. A 20th century roadmap to settler architecture. The land was flat then, inarticulate. No trees stood against the sky. My shadow, the tallest structure I knew. Two matched rows of houses, the time span of our street built to affirm no opposites. Drapes at dusk pulled across sightlines. Childhood a crawl space the future rose out of. Echo sustained by slide rules of dry air, blueprints trusted. Open spaces drawing crossbeams of thought. Each roof the wind-blown wings of a city. New hypotheses, new towers ascending. Their assured axes, the conduits I've sought through words. The freeways, clear tonalities, blinding the stars with light past ascending. A poem about my mother. And I swear everything in this poem is true. Wasp, Queen. Up it flew, while swords of gladioli she chose dropped. A mauve slaughter at her feet, bell of her dress flaring, amplifying her flair for improv, hem swept high to free what zigzagged her stocking, a tripped running muddle of girdle clasps and tap dance hoop hops under the flower stall's canvas arch, stung, lurched to a lamppost where, right on the spot, she rolled down her nylon top, kicking off a closed-toe shoe, less Liza Minnelli than Jean Harlow, vampish with her midriff exposed or barely, such swagger nervy and over In seconds as odd, we watched from the car, my mother seldom so caught. And a queen wasp had actually flown up her skirt. Now a poem about my father. And the title of this poem means hatred of sound. All through breakfast, he makes his teacup chime, plain spoken as a metronome, alarm forcing my back teeth to ache, spoon clenched between his index and thumb, milling lumps of sugar through milk and topi, mold-stained water. Each cube a bathysphere, I'm trapped inside. Their hulls hammered by a tinkling maelstrom, he slows, speeds up, cacophony in free fall, patience stretched, till I'm weightless, aquanaut, awash among numb starfish, saucers swamped, mopped up by the Albertan, murky headlines fatal and tossed away before I've time to walk to school alone. Our street, a calm uphill curve, deaf to rhyme. So that's a child's view of a man having a relaxing breakfast over the newspaper. I'm sure he had no idea how much his stirring his teacup with his spoon chiming against the sides drove me crazy as a child. And my father is British. And when the war broke out in 1939, he was 18. And he worked for the Air Ministry in London before he enlisted. And after he died, my sister Pam and I, we found among his papers a letter he wrote to his mother, where he recounts watching a plane being shot out of the sky. And the poem opens with a quote from the British writer Henry Green. Flame came to be called a light. They talked of putting the light out. Bombardment, September 1940. Stunned, it hangs above the panicked city. Aerolons rimmed with fire. Shorn fuselage igniting as it cartwheels. Flinty edge of the nose wedging through a vacancy braced between facades on your narrow street. You angled from a window slit. Large void above, the skies a spotlit cortege, somersaulting smoke corkscrewing from wings freed to smash on impact. The wrapped blocks beyond Russell Square after martyring the docks. An embered fall you wrote your mother of before signing up. Nerve corresponding to nothing you later flew. A flame caught in ink and lit years on to spark my awe. And now a poem about my sister Pam, who is 6 years older. And I'm now the age she was when she died. Arrival and departure. My collarbone lightly broken. You took me camping. Marine layer damp in my hair as I stepped off the ferry alone, bare-headed, sunburned nose stung by kelp, and felt awkward till you stood out from the crowd, waiting for foot traffic to clear customs, calm, sisterly, and pleased I'd crossed. The sum of the sea's pull, collapsed crash of surf loud in my ears when years later I'm adrift by your bed as two nurses unhook you, your body a raft wrecked to hold you, too wrecked to hold you here, unanchored as you seldom were, tipped safe with provision stowed and course plotted. Our fingers slip not, my grip can't keep taut. This next poem is takes its title from a double album by Joan Baez, which Pam gave me when I was 13. It contains Baez's cover of the band's song, The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. And I think in the poem, I'm trying to suggest that more than anyone, Pam shaped my taste and my moral outlook. Blessed are. A double album cloaked in Christmas foil, slipped among winter socks and books, hopeless, untried vinyl to stack and observe drop, the discs played, removed, flipped, restacked, the full unscratched vibrato of her voice well-traveled as the platter on my portable turned, the stylus grinding Dixie down, the stern resistance of the frets she pressed, civil protest, string by string, touch affirmed, your gift, pathos grooved in ethos, an acoustic spinning, a revolution spun inward, sister tuning brother, Baez, a lift from self-doubt, notes of witness ecstatic, the spindle's gyre, upending all I'd heard. Another poem about Pam. In the early 1990s, Pam and her husband Doug traveled in Asia for several months. And of all the stories she told about the trip, this one made the deepest impression on me because it was so characteristic of who she was. Between bullet trains. This hours-long stop's name you know. See yourself holding a pen to surely transfer it to a sealed envelope. Your cursive crisp and probing, lightly inked, unclouded proof you'd let note paper unfold to a girl from this town, warming her to faraway mountain peaks you'd watch go icy blue-gray from your bedroom window. Foothills snow whirled to Japan, melted since. And you wait here in middle age, unused time on your hands between trains. So you look for and find her, a cloudless voice she let fade against heard, her albums browse till there you are, blonde, hair blonde, brushed the same as now, eyes at 16, clear. And just to give a little bit of context, she and Doug were waiting for a connection in this town in Japan, and Pam recognized the name of the town, and she went looking for her pen pal from, God knows, 30 years before, and found her. And her friend's mother invited them back for tea, and she pulled out this photo album and flipped open, and there was a picture of Pam. And just can't get over the idea that that picture had been sitting there and kept for a very long time. So I'm going to shift focus a bit away from my birth family, and there are many poems that reflect upon the experience of being part of a queer family. And the poem I'm going to read takes its title from James Baldwin's landmark novel of the late 1950s about being queer. The narrator, a white American, recounts his ill-fated affair with an Italian waiter the night before his lover's execution. And it begins with an epigraph from Baldwin, which is, I am too various to be trusted. Giovanni's Room. Bookstores took its name in many cities and pubs in others, as did side street clubs where men sent drinks to men, sought sex, found drugs, some in dark back rooms since the pitiless shelters it limbs defined, The cold, off-track sanctums, scorn found to avoid itself in, walls and bulbs naked, undraped windows dim, as though self-hate waxed to hide the air shaft. What we paged our lost way through, the squalor, his words blew open, a door to sunlight and cafes near the Seine, to the matchless rive droite, Haussmann's thoroughfares claimed as ours outside the law, Baldwin, cigarette lit, drafting from guillotine shame, a chrysalis. And so the next poem, the events recounted in it are considered by many to be Canada's equivalent to the Stonewall riots. And it begins with an epigraph from Roland Barthes. Reality is fiction, writing is truth. Such is the ruse of language. Bathhouse raids, Toronto, February 1981. That they may have stood outside in towels resists analysis, since I don't know if police lined them up, down, young, exposed to cold and cameras, names taken, allowed no cover after couples were decoupled, embraces split and tongues withdrawn or worse, men cuffed with slurs lust can't mouth, perverse unease ad hoc, rubbed dry without scruple, but to make words come clean, to leave behind remorse, let me say, named and unnamed men, later gathered clothed in anger, men caught, no more but candid agents undefined by all agencies not their own, the streets frank, stripped down to laws discreet, but not discreet. So the next poem is about the sort of, it is set in the quintessential scuzzy gay bar in Ottawa called Centertown Pub. At the time I'm recounting in this poem, it was actually called Central Park. And the title incorporates the Portuguese for sherry. School of Ziras Fino. Toxic, the club where we met, run down now, run down then, the Johns sequined with beer, dim crush of moon flesh dancing, the strobes freeze frame, history painting, a stock animation, mirror balls, matches, condoms, sweat raw limbs, shedding shirts, shedding disco, shrill amyl nitrate, Doc Martens, plucked or pierced eyebrows, ripped chinos, zigzagging tans, shyness shunned, sherry, your cheeky decanted ploy to haul me home, to fortify us both, pouring dryly from our clothes after scorching cold flamed our skin, run from din, making you bold, air smokeless, one candle lit, till you wore me out and down, our legs dawn slaked and sprawled. And that was a request from Carmen. The next poem is actually inspired by a real place. It's a museum in Zagreb, Croatia. Folded on the steps of the Museum of Broken Relationships. What numbness you've left me, no detergent will lift from fabrics it's worked itself into. A regret so true the weave can't loosen to let pass. My flesh coarse, naked when dressed. The shirts I gave you kept in my closet, washed or new and unworn. No other man as slight, shoulders trim, upholding the span of yokes stitched and restitched till they would fit the stranger in you. buttoned and polished, my off-the-rack tears and sweat binding them to your skin, unknowable to us both who you are. A shirt no iron could touch, lassitude you let slip off without blame. Light dropped to the floor as your shape was lost. So, no book about the last third of the 20th century uh, can ignore the impact HIV had on the life of the lives of the men of my generation. And I have a friend who lives in New York, and she knew many people who died. And at the height of the AIDS pandemic, she often had to help clear out the apartments of friends who died. And she often had to find new owners for some of the possessions that they just couldn't, give to the thrift shops. And she gave me a bracelet, which I'm actually wearing. If you can see it, I'll take it off. Yeah, it's just a beautiful copper bracelet that belonged to a friend of hers. And she gave it to me about, I don't know, 20 years ago. So the poem is called Kenny's Bracelet. A twined, hammered twist of what's left of him. Nickel, copper, brass. A glinting soldered echo you heard, found in his apartment. Found as his apartment was emptied out. Noise-tamped studio dim with what became the East Village. Retro when gentrified. How he lived forgotten. What killed him a virus loving thousands of men. An artifact. The past's scarecrow outstaring fear. Garbage cleared from Broadway. The ignored way he died. Not how we are let go. Dying now. His bracelet, a scar you wrap about my wrist, longing reclaimed, a molten link my skin warms. How like me he used to sit, hands clasped about one knee. And the next poem, it honors the men killed by the serial killer who terrorized Toronto's gay village practically unchecked through the past decade or more. Fortunately, he was caught in 2018. Coda for the victims. It takes no self-consciousness to guess how a landscaper could pick them. The tapped swipe of their profiles, such null bodies his type, disassembled already by the cropped gaze of their smartphones, parts isolated from their eyes, shaved or engorged trunks of brown skin, oceans away from home, or ground down by what being born here has made them prey to. Invasive species, he would text lines and root from cover with the funk of sex. Horny men used to rough white hands, not death. Stripped limbs he disjoints before he consigns them to mulch he rakes flat. Unseen index of those too few miss, us all psychopaths. So switching again slightly in the book, there's a section called Chosen Family, which explores how we make family, including how we express solidarity with others. And the poem I'm going to read is inspired by rereading a book by Pat Lowther that's in the title of the poem. And Pat Lowther wrote poems of solidarity with those who were disappeared in the aftermath of the coup against Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, which I remember quite well. And Pat Lowther herself was a victim of violence, murdered by her estranged husband in 1975. As I was reading her work, I found myself wondering what she might have written in response to the crisis in Syria, had she lived. And it begins with an epigraph from Pat Lowther, which is, "Our eyes like the eyes of humans." After rereading a stone diary, displaced, they cross borders. The mountains cold, while women leading their children, while children on their own melt across them, flow insistent, so quartz brisk and molten, fled cities mortared, startled flood looking frozen, cracked seam of opal through feldspar, glaciers, moonlit lamps sheathed by cirques, far up, passes Europe strains to block, they risk breaching to reach stoves with pots, beds with walls around them, windows they open, perhaps wash, not shelters, but homes, the sky onyx, the stars pure, and lands whose absolutes shall harbor them, though sometimes our dead are found in rivers, weighted by stones or men's hands. And the next poem is about where I live. And this poem describes a slope I walk up several times a week in Beacon Hill Park, which is 3 blocks from where I live. The title is a word from Lekwungen, the family, which is a family of languages spoken by the indigenous peoples who reside here. And it describes this slope best and helps anchor me in a true relationship with where I live better than anything else. Its meaning in English forms part of the last line of this poem. Miquan. Sheltered behind a screen of wind-ravished arbutus, their roots picked out in camas and fawn lilies, outrun by narcissus, I've scaled the slope they rise above, burnished by salt lifting from the sea. Those who first lay against it to sky gaze, unrehearsed in views the next to come had transplanted, a tipped savanna of traits, cloudy slant imposed on what's lasted as knowable, but private about earth. Our scavenging, aloof idiolect, eroding range. Anyone this climb rakes susceptible to what the land's inclined to speak. This hill, warmed by the sun, my face, heat washed as till. The next poem, which I kind of think is as representative of the heart of the chosen family, is about the consolations of true friendship. And it's for my friend Philip in Ottawa. Feng Shui Unbound. You longed for a wingback chair and window, never found the ideal matching pair. Countless arms too low, seats soft, slanted glare, double panes of glass slid across your floor, outlining the slim-fitting solitude you kept on wearing, not in your single necktie, rubbing silk to knot, prodigal in all but time. The gauzy interlude we would call our youth fading back toward upholstered layers of dusk, men you'd looked for in sunless bars leading to candlelit meals served to old friends, laid in wines uncorked at the large makeshift table you adore, straight back chairs pulled in close, the squaring fit. And the last poem I will read is the concluding poem of this section. And again, it's about Victoria. And it opens with a quote from a poem by W.H. Auden called I Walked Out One Evening. And the lines from Auden are, life remains a blessing, although you cannot bless. 3 amazing things I saw on Thursday. While I was out walking late one evening toward the Salish Sea beneath dusk-stained chestnuts, the laterns budding flame sustained by rain-rinsed air, the calm, unplumbed meaning behind the peacock's crazed, sitar-sharp cries unscored. I stopped to watch a freshly horned stag twist blossoms off, bent off, stag twist blossoms off, bent low and forlorn boughs of cherry. His soft lips grimaced wide. The tide flat on the bias as blue milky linen to the shore where I next stood. Waves rocked against the dimness stars shed. A single dangling thread of mist slipped through a gap in the Souk hills until the last of tangential day by crispness spread. So thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to your questions.
It was a beautiful reading, John. Thanks for that. Now we arrive at the second act of the show, Ross Leckey. From his outpost in Fredericton, Ross has been one of the most quietly influential figures in Canadian poetry, principally through his work as Director of Creative Writing at the University of New Brunswick, as editor of the Fiddlehead Literary Magazine, and as poetry editor for Goose Lane Editions. He has been a vital, animating force in his local scene, but also a great mentor to younger poets across the country. It's no surprise as well that he has published 3 incredibly fine books of his own poetry. His debut, A Slow Light, was, as previously mentioned, published with Véhicule back in 1983, and his most recent, and maybe one of my favorite books of Canadian poetry ever, Gravity's Plumb Line, published with Gaspereau Press. An exquisite chapbook from Frog Hollow Press called The Critique of Pure Reason appeared in 2013, and it promises that a brilliant new collection is in the offing, one that I am impatient to see. I'm incredibly glad Ross was able to make time for this. I know that he and John are old friends, and I'm looking forward to their conversation.
Thank you, Carmen. Thank you, John, for a marvelous reading, and congratulations on your new book, which
Thank you, Ross.
Exciting. I'll start with the obvious question: why sonnets? But let me put it in a bit of a context that you can think about. We can think of about at least 3 ways in which content and form can abut in a sonnet. In one case, you can think of the sonnet as artifice. So it's decorative, it's foregrounding, it's rhymes, it's bells and whistles, and so on. It's like an 18th century clock. Another would be the sort of naturalist sonnet, and thinking of Wordsworth and picturing, the sonnet as a depiction, like a little painting, a miniature in a frame. And then perhaps a third way might be thinking about it as agonistic, like emotions, ideas, language, enjambment, pushing at the very boundaries of what a sonnet can contain, and fighting with those. And I was wondering if you could think about or talk to us about, the way you thought of the form, and, how did that move, and how did it occur in the writing process over the time that you've been working on these?
A difficult question. What attracted me to the sonnet is almost an accident. I brought Molly Peacock to Victoria when I was the editor of the Metal Hat Review to give a lecture, and I had to arrange for her to go into some classes at the University of Victoria, and one was a second-year poetry class. And, after all the efforts of making possible for her to come, I was going to benefit from every single minute of her presence in Victoria as much as I could. And so I went with her, not knowing what she was going to do, that she was going to give a brief lecture on how to write a sonnet. And then there was a half-hour period in which the students were supposed to write one. And I had to borrow a pen and some paper, and I wrote a sonnet in half an hour, much to my shock and amazement. And I think all my attractions to the form are kind of summarized in the three things that you raised. I've had a fascination with form for at least a decade, and so I love the idea of the shape. I kind of like to think of a sonnet as 140 syllables, and that's my, that's about as gassy as I can get. Um, and I love the struggle with the form to um, to explore ideas, and emotion. And I love this constraint that they imposed. You only have this much space to express everything. And I guess the other thing I wanted to do was bring everything else I have in my toolkit to the form. And Carmen mentioned one of them. Nearly every single sonnet in this book has a single run-on sentence. And so I kind of think of the form as almost like a luge. I'm a Olympic athlete in a luge, and I get in at the top, and I go whistling down the line, and every line ending is a turn, and I got 14 turns to make, and then I'm shot out at the end, and I better be done, and I better survive.
And I guess in a luge, you go feet first.
Yeah, yeah, yes. Well, iambic feet first.
Um, when we think of the great sonnets in the Elizabethan period, Spenser, Sidney, Shakespeare, they're called sonnet sequences, and yet people spend a lot of time trying to parse. Okay, well, what is the structure of Shakespeare's sonnets as a whole? Do they cohere in different ways? And as you know, there have been all kinds of ways of parsing that. Well, your book is very carefully constructed with sections and so on. So I was wondering how you conceive of it as a whole, and how you think of it as a sequence as opposed to the individual poems.
Well, one of the influences on the book has actually been creative nonfiction, and in part because one of my closest friends here in Victoria for a while was the president of the Creative Nonfiction Coalition Collective. I never remember the name. And so I became quite interested in the form, and she kept having sort of this conquesting attitude towards poetry, like creative nonfiction is just poetry is just another version of creative nonfiction, and so I began to think about that as intrinsic to the form. And in fact, Molly, who's she's everywhere in this book, she gave a workshop on what she called the sonnet a secret essay. And so, in fact, the file folder on my computer for the whole project is called Personal Essay. And so I think of the sections of the book as chapters in a memoir. If you look at the table of contents, it doesn't list the titles of the poems. And each of the chapters looks at some aspect of my life. The first chapter, of course, is about childhood and the untamable drives of a child. And then I look at my father in the next chapter. And so I wrote the sonnets purposely as a way of expressing autobiography and letting the form tell me about my life.
I think that the sense of the personal comes across very strongly. We could hear it tonight in your reading and the way you describe the poems and for whom they were written and so on. Often we think of memoir as kind of both revealing and concealing things at the same time. And I was curious, like one of the things about a sonnet is the sense that you can kind of control and constrain the things you might want to conceal while revealing others things that become apparent in the form. And did you always have a sense of that? Did you have a sense of, okay, the things I want to talk about and the things I want to keep to myself?
I think what I'd rather say is that, I mean, the struggle with the form, I think, for many people is how do you write something so structured and retain natural language, like retain a voice? And so I really saw the form as a tool of exploration. Once you've established your rhyme scheme, for example, um, and I would establish the rhyme scheme, and then I would continue when I got to a line that had to rhyme with something above, I would literally go into my Oxford Rhyming Dictionary, which is, I think, the best, and see what the words were, and let that word that I chose, whichever one seemed to resonate, to direct me deeper into my subject. And so I don't know if I was trying to conceal something, more like I wanted to find out what I was concealing from myself, um, through either, forgetting in the form, twigging my memory about something as small as, I don't know, watching my mother get stung by a queen bee. Um, and also, what I would say though about the form is it prevented me from going on and on and on about something. I could, I, I, um, I, it just, so the concision. So I had to figure out what was important.
Yeah. Are you suggesting, by the way, that you were finding the rhyming words before you were actually writing the lines that would connect them?
Yes. Well, I
Fast.
didn't choose them all. I did them line by line. Like as I write, first quatrain, and I would be stuck with some, you know, awkward A B rhyme or something, or whichever. There are a number of rhyme schemes through the book. There's Shakespearean, there's Petrarchan, there's the French rhyme scheme, the Sicilian. Um, I did find that the rhyme schemes influenced the poems. I can see why the Shakespearean sonnet is preferred in English, partly because it offers more opportunity for rhyme, more choices. But yeah, no, I would literally let the word that I needed to rhyme with influence what came next, and so it was almost like a form of suggestion, as if I was I was self I was the analysis and the psychologist or the psychiatrist and the analysat. I was patient and doctor at the same time.
That's a terrifying prospect.
Right.
Last question before we turn things over to the audience. Uh, as you're writing sonnets, and obviously this must have taken place over a fair bit of time, you must have a sense of growing into the form in a lot of ways, uh, and becoming, gaining an expertise. Obviously, at a certain point, you start to presumably expand your sense of what is possible in the sonnet. And is the book ordered in close to a chronology, or is it holding, or do poems move according to the subject to whom they're addressed?
I think it's more a subject influence. It's not in a sort of a linear. They're not published in the order in which they were composed. In fact, I only really started keeping track of the order sort of around sonnet 200. And then I thought, well, maybe I should, so I had to start numbering them just to make sure, because I'd set this goal. I was going to write 360 sonnets, God damn it. And so in order to make sure, I had to number them. But It's funny, the book represents a percentage of the sonnets that I've written, and I've been revising some of the sonnets didn't get into the book. And what I would say is that my grasp of the form is much more fluid, and it's much easier to do the revising. I can see that I wasn't able to think as clearly at the beginning of um, my voyage into the form than I can now. And I almost think of revising as like I'm stripping them down to the bones. Sometimes I feel like all that's left are the rhymes and the syllable count, and I go back in and reflush them.
Well, thanks, John. It's really good to see you. I'll pass things on.
Thank you very much, Ross. Great to see you too.
That was great. And it was actually kind of interesting to see the normally unflappable Ross scandalized by your answer that you had often sort of started with the rhymes, which I didn't know, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have questions. I think we have 5 solid ones, and we should start seeing them now appear. Question. As someone equally as obsessed with sonnets, this is from Ian Le Tourneau. As someone equally as obsessed with sonnets, I'm wondering which poets who use the sonnet form would you say provided inspiration and or instruction to you? Which ones do you return to?
Oh my goodness. That's a well, I'm not a big studier of the form, I have to admit, but one of the people that I really admire is an American poet named Henri Cole, who's a gay writer who is a practitioner of the form. And
Maybe not as strict as yours, but
they're not
yeah.
as strict as mine.
Yeah.
But they have such a beautiful voice to them, and they're introspective. Molly's sonnets, of course, are important to me.
Yeah.
Robert Frost, Auden himself, who I would think is my great model as a writer.
Great.
Yeah.
It's a good sort of murderer's row of sonneteers. That's a really good, yeah. Next question. This is from Sonnet Rigor. I may be mispronouncing it. Rigier, 13 years old. How do you feel reflecting on your life in this way?
I feel that I know myself better.
Ah.
And the struggles in the book, coming to terms with the death of my sister in particular, it was an important struggle. And when she died, I was afraid that I didn't remember her life very well. And so at least I have something to go back to with the sonnets, and I hope they're a gift to my family as much as anything else.
Well, I have a quick question. Have you heard from your family about the book?
Not yet. I mean, yeah, the word is still out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a third one from Brian Bartlett. Does the subtitle of your collection with the single suggest that the book can or should be read as one poem? It's a great question.
In a way, it's a long poem. But as I said in response to Ross's questions, I truly think of it as a memoir. And so each of the sections is like a separate essay on a distinct topic that are interlinked. There is a voyage in the book that I suppose suggests that it is a single work. The first poem ends with the word hesitant, And the last poem in the book ends with "I am sure."
Mm.
And I think of the book as that journey. And the last poem, which I didn't read, is a series of 7 sonnets called "A Crown." And actually, when I thought I'd finished writing the sonnets for this book, I heard an interview, a CBC program, and they quoted Alden Nolan. It was like a medical program, and they quoted Alden Nolan saying, "The only way to get over grief is to imagine your own death." And I thought, okay. And so that the final poem is imagining that.
Yeah. Okay. 4th question from John Rebatance. Do you see any connections between your early poems on Emily Carr, an outcast artist, and these poems?
Well, there is one sonnet about Emily Carr in this book. It recounts how I came to know about Emily Carr, which is my mother reading me her stories, because of course Carr wrote memoirs of her own, and also coming to terms with the fact that she appropriated the images of the indigenous people, um, of the coast, and coming to terms with um, and that I, in the same way, did the same thing. But I suppose it's that memoir, that desire to recall and remember and preserve, which Carr did in the last years of her life, um, in the writing of her 4 or 5 books. So yes, I see a connection that way. And the book about Emily Carr that I wrote when I was in my 20s, it is an arc through her life, spoken in her voice. And I often felt that book was kind of a closet memoir of my own, of trying to figure out what it was like to become an artist, what it meant to be an artist, to have a vocation. And so this time, the book is in my voice.
Nice. And last question from Anita Leahy. Okay, new question. I guess she had asked an earlier question. In our conversations about these poems and some of the stories and moments contained within, I have always been struck by your kindness and tenderness toward your younger selves. Not all of us can achieve these. We tend to be hard on ourselves. I'm wondering if this is intrinsic to your character or whether making the poems helped you come to this place, which seems like, oh, Jack, can you put the question back up? Which seems like a kind of acceptance of your own life story. So, is the tenderness you've shown your younger self intrinsic to who you are, or was it a function of the poems?
Well, you could almost wonder if I'm just letting myself off the hook.
Yeah.
But I think I wanted to look at myself, especially the younger poems about my childhood. Like when you look back at yourself as a child, it's almost as if that's another person. It's like, and so I wanted to capture who that person was. And I suppose we have a kind of nostalgia for our who we were as children. Um, and the other thing I would say is that I guess to reveal myself, I um, had to be in order to flesh out the memories. I had to be kind. I had to. I didn't want to judge myself. I, I want the reader to make the judgments about the experiences that I'm describing. Um, and I have an essay in my avatars called "Embarrassment, Vulnerability, and the Final Draft." And basically, in a nutshell, I want to be as vulnerable as I can be in the poems, and I don't want to be embarrassed by how they're written. I want them to be as strong as they can be, and I want what's revealed to be as truthful and as real and as almost like cinema verite as it can be. That was always my goal. And I guess the other thing I would say is that these poems are just not about me. They're about all these people who I knew, my mother and my father, my sister, and we have an older sister as well. And to bring them out into the open as well, I had to be kind. Because of course, families are full of secrets, and I've spilled a few. So I'm not going to, it's not about judgment. This is not about judgment. It's about revealing. I often think of poetry, we always think it's self-expression. I think of it as expression.
That's great. I think we're done. And the winner of the book draw is Regier.
Kieran Regier.
Kieran, you have to email us at the email address in that sort of banner, and we will send you your book. So great questions. That was a great discussion with Ross. That was a great reading.
Oh, thank you.
I feel privileged to have published his book. I just feel badly that that my editing wasn't as thorough as yours has been on my stuff. You handed me a very immaculate manuscript, except for some poking and prodding, pro forma poking and prodding. I didn't have much to do, sorry to say. But it is a beautiful book, and I'm extremely proud to have published it. And yes, so this was a wonderful launch. Thank you, John. Thank you, Ross, who's in the backstage watching all this. And thanks to my wife, Jennifer Varconi, who has been sort of behind the scenes managing the tech.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And I want to thank everybody who's listened in. We know you're out there. And have good evenings. We should point out that this reading crosses 4 time zones.
That's right. Yeah, the publicity material on the reading sort of had to acknowledge that. It was very confusing, I admit.
Yeah, it's kind of a miracle of technology. Yeah. We can overcome pandemics.
Yeah. All right, so I think this is it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. Please buy the book.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.